Feuerbach is not, he's somewhat important for you. You'll see him once in a while, Feuerbach. So religion, therefore, is nothing else than the consciousness of the infinity of the consciousness. Or in the consciousness of the infinite, the conscious subject has for its object the infinity of its own nature. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Thus, God is nothing else than man. He is, so to speak, the outward projection of man's inward nature. Feuerbach, in his work entitled On Philosophy and Christianity, established that Hegelianism was incompatible with Christianity. In The Essence of Christianity, he says that religion is merely a hallucination of man who, in his innate desire to raise himself up, objectivizes for himself an object which does not exist, his own desires and egotistical aspirations of the heart. Therefore, man is really glorifying and adoring himself when he worships God. Now remember what Paul VI says. The cult of man has met the cult of God, and was there a clash? No, that was his speech at the end of the council. It's all from this stuff. How could there not be a clash between Roman Catholicism and this garbage? That's like a tornado-bearing thunderstorm. Therefore, there is no other real God than man himself. There is no other religion than humanism. There is no theological science other than anthropology. Studying man, you study God. God is merely an objectivization which man makes of himself, who is the true supreme being. Well, this has to come from the pits of hell, this stuff. But it's all, you shall be like gods. It all goes back to Genesis. Philosophically speaking, Feuerbach was a materialist and a sensualist. Only that exists which produces a feeling of pleasure. Man is nothing else than what he eats. All right. Stirner, he's a minor figure, really, but it's worth seeing. Johann Caspar Schmidt, all right, 1806 to 1856, better known as Max Stirner, or Stirner, the nom de plume he adopted from a schoolyard nickname he had acquired as a child because of his high brow, Stern, German philosopher who ranks as one of the literary grandfathers of nihilism, existentialism, and anarchism. Wonderful things. Especially of individualist anarchism. Oh, we were talking about names. Is your real first name Xavier? Oh, there was some sort of rumor going around in De Deo Uno that your real first name is Xavier. No, all right, then I won't call you Xavier. All right, because we were having trouble because we were talking about truth in God, and then, subsistent truth and all sorts of things about truth, and of course it became rather humorous. Stirner himself explicitly denied holding any absolute position in his philosophy, further stating that except the fact that he's holding no absolute position. They always contradict themselves. I'm not holding any absolute position. There's no such thing as an absolute. The contradiction is there. Don't you see it? You see, there's always an absolute. There's always a highest principle. There's no such thing as the highest principle. That's the highest principle. See? Especially, further stating that if he must be identified with some ism, let it be egoism. the antithesis of all ideologies and social causes as he conceived of it. Stirner's main work is The Ego and Its Own, also known as The Ego and His Own, Der Einzige und sein Eigentum, which was first published in Leipzig 1844 and has since appeared in numerous editions and translations. Stirner was born in Bayreuth, Bavaria. Anybody know anything about Bayreuth in Bavaria? Something famous about Bayreuth? Richard Wagner. Okay. Does anyone know who Richard Wagner is? Okay. So, on October 25th, 1806, what little is known of his life is mostly due to the Scottish-born German writer John Henry Mackay, who wrote a biography of Stirner, Max Stirner, sein Leben und sein Werk, which means his life and work, published in German in 1898. Stirner attended university in Berlin, where he attended the lectures of Hegel, who was to become a vital source of inspiration for his thinking, and on the structure of whose work, Phenomenology of Spirit, Phänomenologie des Geistes, which is the same thing, he modeled his own book. So you can see Hegel really is the man in the 19th century. I mean, he influenced a lot of people in the 19th century. While in Berlin, Stirner joined in 1841 that faction of the so-called Young Hegelians who clustered around Bruno Bauer. Now let's look at Bruno Bauer. 1809 to 1882 was a German philosopher and theologian. As a student of G.W.F. Hegel, Bauer was a radical rationalist in philosophy, politics, and biblical criticism. Right, so he and Strauss were the big rationalists in biblical criticism of the 19th century. So Bauer and Strauss. Yes?
Is it common for lay people to take theology?
This is Protestants. For all lay people. See, all of modernism began in Protestantism early on. Like from 1800 on, they were going modernist. There was a reaction in Protestantism against it, but the Protestants were the first ones to cook up all of this stuff. And then it spread to Catholicism. Bauer investigated the sources of the New Testament, and beginning with Hegel's Helleноphile orientation, that means Greek. Hellas in Greek means Greece. Anytime you see Hellen or any Hellenic or Hellenistic, that's Greece. Concluded that early Christianity owed more to ancient Greek philosophy, Stoicism, than to Judaism. Bruno Bauer is also known by his association and sharp break with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and by his later association with Max Stirner and Friedrich Nietzsche. Those two make Engels and Marx look good. Starting in 1840, he began a series of works arguing that Jesus was a second-century fusion of Jewish, Greek, and Roman theology. So you see we think of the 19th century as sort of a nice time, horses and buggies and, a somewhat traditional time. It was not. It was a revolution. It was an intellectual revolution, political revolution. Those things, there was a cap on some of those things at times. But all of these really radical ideas were being generated that will have an influence on the 20th century and then our own century too. It all goes back to that Enlightenment period, which in turn goes back to the Protestant Reformation. 1517 is the big day, yes?
So you said there was a reaction within Protestantism?
Yes. It's called, I can't remember the name of it, but there are some big figures, Paul Tillich, some big figures in it that reacted to this. I just can't remember off the top of my head. There's a name for it. Protestantism is not one of my favorite subjects. So that's Bruno Bauer. So some of the best known names in 19th century literature were members of the Young Hegelians, including Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, and Arnold Ruge. We'll see him next. So this was a nest of cockroaches. All right. While some of the young Hegelians were eager subscribers to Hegel's dialectical method and attempted to apply dialectical approaches to Hegel's conclusions, the left-wing members of the young Hegelians, that is, for example, those named above, broke with Hegel. Feuerbach and Bauer led this charge. Frequently, the debates would take place at Hippel's, a Weinstube, which is a wine bar, in Friedrichstrasse, which means Frederick Street, attended by, among others, the young Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, at that time still adherents of Feuerbach. So you see where all of this comes from. Engels and Marx are the creators of communism. They are adherents of Feuerbach. I mean, this is from the devil. This is from hell, this stuff. The only portrait we have of Stirner consists of a cartoon by Engels drawn 40 years later from memory on the request of Stirner's biography, John Henry Mackay. Stirner worked as a schoolteacher employed in an academy for young girls when he wrote his major work, The Ego and Its Own, in which in large part is a polemic against both Hegel and some young Hegelians. For example, Ludwig Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, but also against communists as Wilhelm Weitling, and against the anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. He resigned his teaching position in anticipation of the controversy arising from his major works publication in October 1844. Stirner married twice. His first wife was a household servant with whom he fell in love at an early age. Soon after their marriage, she died due to complications with pregnancy in 1838. In 1843, he married Marie Deinhardt, an intellectual associated with Die Freien. Now we'll see what Die Freien. Die Freien, the Free Ones, was a 19th century circle of young Hegelians formed at the University of Berlin and gathering for informal discussion over a period of a few years. Its leader was Bruno Bauer, a student who had attended Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's lectures and was then asked to defend the position of the old Hegelians against the claims of David Strauss's Life of Jesus. That should be two S's. After reviewing the book, Bauer was converted and became even more radical than Strauss, becoming an atheist and arguing that Christianity was not only historically baseless, but it was also irrational and a barrier to progress. They divorced in 1846, so that didn't last long. The bitter, ironic dedication of The Ego and Its Own to my sweetheart, Marie Deinhardt, may hint at the reasons for the shortness of their liaison. Marie later converted to Catholicism and died in 1902 in London. So I guess there must have been some heated discussions in that home. One of the most curious events in those times was that Stirner planned and financed with his second wife's inheritance an attempt by some young Hegelians to own and operate a milk shop on cooperative principles. This enterprise failed because the German dairy farmers harbored suspicions of these well-dressed intellectuals with their confusing talk about profit sharing and other high-minded ideals. Meanwhile, the milk shop, these people, what do they know about? They wouldn't know a cow from an elephant. Meanwhile, the milk shop appeared so ostentatiously decorated that most of the customers felt too poorly dressed to buy their milk there. After The Ego and Its Own, Stirner published German translations of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and Jean-Baptiste Say's, that should be Traité d'économie politique and a History of Reaction. In 1856, Stirner died in Berlin, Prussia, from an infected insect bite. See how easily you could die in those days? I mean, today you just go to one of these, treatment, the emergency urgent care places. They would fix you up right away. You never knew what you're going to die of. As the story goes, Bruno Bauer was the only young Hegelian present at his funeral. Max Stirner followed Feuerbach in his negation of God and the divinization of humanity. For Stirner, man is everything and is the supreme being. There is nothing above man. The spiritual is an illusion. There is nothing more to the real world than the ego and the food which nourishes me. Any questions? Yeah.
Since the other right-wing Hegelians?
Yep. We did the right-wing Hegelians, I think. I think we did. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that is. Yes, those are the right-wingers. Yes. I probably just forgot to put the... So, Arnold Ruge, 1802 to 1880. So he's contemporary with all of these people. German philosopher and political writer, was born at Bergen on the island of Rügen on the 13th of September 1802. He studied at Halle, Jena, of course, and Heidelberg, and became an adherent of the party which sought to create a free and united Germany. For his zeal, he was confined for 5 years to the fortress of Kolberg, famous, where he studied. There was allies who escaped from Kolberg in World War II. It's a famous escape. Anyway, where he studied Plato and the Greek poets. On his release in 1830, Ruge settled in Halle, where in 1837, and with E.T. Echtermeier, he founded the Hallische Jahrbücher für deutsche Kunst und Wissenschaft, which means the Halle yearbook for German art and science. In this periodical, he discussed the questions of the time from the point of view of the Hegelian philosophy. The Jahrbücher was detested by the Orthodox party in Prussia and was finally suppressed by the Saxon government in 1843. In Paris, Ruge tried to act with Karl Marx as co-editor of the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, the German-French yearbook, but had little sympathy with Marx's socialistic theories and soon left him. In the revolutionary movement of 1848, he organized the extreme left in the Frankfurt Parliament, and for some time he lived in Berlin as the editor of Die Reform. The Prussian government intervened, and Ruge soon afterwards left for Paris, hoping, through his friend Alexandre Ledru-Rollin, to establish relations between German and French Republicans. But in 1849, both Ledru-Rollin, was it? That's either. It's either Rollin or Rollin. It's probably the Rollin. And Ruge had to take refuge in London, which is always the where you go to take refuge. here in company with Giuseppe Mazzini and other did everyone know who Giuseppe Mazzini is? He was the Freemasonic mind of the Italian Risorgimento. There was Mazzini, Garibaldi, and Verdi. Mazzini was the brains, Garibaldi was the brawn, and Verdi was the music. They were all revolutionaries. But Mazzini was there was also Cavour, who was the Prime Minister of Savoy. He was very active in that too. But Mazzini was the real driver of anti-papal revolution in Italy. Freemason. So, when they get in trouble in their countries, they go to London. And other advanced politicians, they formed a European Democratic Committee. Sounds great, From this, Ruge soon withdrew and in 1850 went to Brighton, it's in England on the water, where he supported himself by teaching and writing. In 1866 and 1870, he vigorously supported Prussia against Austria. That was the famous 7 Weeks' War, where Prussia essentially lured Austria into a war and beat them and effectively became the leader of Germany. See, there was a rivalry between who would lead Germany. Germany was gradually coming together as a nation during the 1840s, 50s, etc. It had been divided up into many, many little duchies and princedoms and so forth, tiny places practically by modern standards. And so these were being absorbed by Prussia, and the whole north swath of Germany was already Prussia by that time. And so there was but Austria-Hungary was a big influence in Germany as well. And they had always, Prussia and Austria had always vied for influence over the other German little states. And so Prussia wanted to emerge as the unifier of the German state and wanted to make all of Germany Prussia, which in fact they did. In other words, the Prussian culture just invaded all of the rest of Germany. So they had to knock off Austria and Austria-Hungary. And they did in 1866. And then in 1870, they had to knock off France. France was concerned about an emerging Germany and an emerging Prussia. And Bismarck lured Napoleon the Third, who was a very reactive, kind of impulsive person, and lured him just like an elephant falling into a pit, into a war with Prussia. Prussia was armed to the teeth. France was not. It was not really prepared for war, and things did not go well for France. So that was the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and the Prussians invaded France, and they penetrated, although they went down as far as Nevers, because I remember St. Bernadette was, her convent was affected by the Prussian invasion, so about half of France was occupied by Prussians, and who acted very improperly with regard to the French population. And then Paris went crazy essentially, and turned into a little communist state known as the Paris Commune. That was in 1871, and the Prussians just surrounded Paris in the hills and watched all of the riots and violence and all kinds of horrible things going on in Paris. In order to get out of Paris, you had to go in a balloon, because you couldn't. They had Paris surrounded, so there were some famous, I forget who it was, actually left Paris in a balloon. And there was a lot of shortages, and that's when the cardinal of Paris, who was a big liberal, as a matter of fact, he was put up on a wall and shot by these communists and whatnot. So finally they brought order to, but it was also in 1871 that the Prussians went to Versailles and declared the German Empire. So that they brought in Friedrich Wilhelm, who was the king of Prussia, and then they declared Germany to be an empire. That means it included all of the German states. An empire is something that goes beyond a kingdom. A kingdom is one people and there's a king. If you have many people or peoples under you, you have an empire. So they declare Germany to be an empire. So that was the second Deutsches Reich. The first Deutsches Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. And so but that dissolved after Napoleon. And so they did the Second Reich, and that fell apart after World War I, and then you know what the Third Reich was, right? Reich means, it's very hard to translate Reich. It means kingdom or state, or it's somewhere in between those things, just some sort of state entity, or it doesn't fit into to any English word, the word Reich. That's why it comes over in English as just Reich. So that's a little history for you. So that's why in 1866 and 1870 he vigorously supported Prussia against Austria, that's 1866, and Germany against France. In his last years he received from the German government a pension of 1,000 marks, which was a lot of money. He died on the 31st of December 1880. Arnold Ruge repeated the same themes about God and humanity that are found in Feuerbach and Stirner. So he's a broken record, as we used to say when we played records. What is significant about him, however, is his call for integral humanism. In reaction to Marx. He thought that Marx's communism was too one-sided and neglected the spiritual needs of man. This same theme and the same term, integral humanism, will be taken up by Maritain in the late 1930s. He wrote a book, L'intégrisme intégral. It's in the library. I think it's in my library. I don't want to put it. Either that or it's in hell. But that is a very, very significant work because it is the baptism of the revolution. You see, we're going to take all of the 18th century and 19th century garbage, but we're going to baptize it. You see, it needs a spiritual dimension to it. That's Paul VI. Maritain was the mentor of Paul VI. And that's Paul VI going to the UN and saying, you are the last hope of humanity. And if you read all of the statements of Paul VI, that integral humanism is evident in it. So it's a very significant thing, and it comes from these dogs of the 19th century. So we can accept humanism, all of this vomit from the 19th century. We can accept that, but we have to lift it up and give it a spiritual dimension. That's the Novus Ordo. And it has a heavy influence on Paul VI. What it represents is a marriage of atheistic humanism and Christian spiritual principles. It is also the spirit of the Sillon and of Christian democracy. The Sillon was a movement in France at the turn of the century under Pius X that incorporated all of these ideas. And Christian democracy in Italy. Same thing. Accept the revolution and give it a Christian sauce. It's the enemy. And it's more of an enemy even than all of these creatures that we're talking about here, because it has the Christian sauce on it. Yes?
Do we study integral humanism in this course?
No, but I could. I don't have it in here, but it really, it's sort of balanced between, I mean, it kind of belongs to the new theology, which is Father Disposito. I don't know if he does it or not, but we should, because it is very important. So thank you for reminding me. But it's not in this course. It's quasi-theological. He was a Maritain. The early Maritain is very, very good. But then he married that Raisa Maritain. I don't know if she had anything to do with it, but she was a converted Jew. And he had some sort of conversion at the end of the 1930s to this integral humanism. I don't know if she had anything to do with it, but something came over him. He was the assistant, you might say, of Garrigou-Lagrange. I mean, Maritain and Garrigou-Lagrange were practically synonymous. Both very, very intelligent and vocal neo-Thomists, and neo-Thomists in the sense of presenting Thomism to the 20th century, and very good at it. Maritain's works in philosophy are his early works are excellent. Excellent. More difficult to understand than Garrigou, but they're excellent. I always say, therefore, people, it's like the professor's book. It's after you've learned philosophy, then you can read Maritain, at least in my opinion. You have to know what he's talking about first. He's not a good pedagogue in that sense, but he is a good philosopher. All right, any questions or problems? Idealistic evolutionism. Now, this is very important too. Evolutionism, you cannot underestimate the influence of evolutionism on the modern world. Idealistic evolutionism in general, we have already examined the idealistic evolutionism of Hegel as well as his pantheism. It now remains to examine the thoughts of a very influential philosopher, Henri Bergson. So he's a French Jew. Right? Bergson, 1859-1941. Henri Bergson was born in Paris in the Rue Lamartine, not far from the Palais Garnier, the old Paris Opera House. He was descended from a Polish-Jewish family, originally Bergson, and on his father's side, and while his mother was from an English and Irish Jewish background. It's very unusual, living in France yet. His family lived in London for a few years after his birth, and he obtained an early familiarity with the English language from his mother. Before he was 9, his parents crossed the English Channel and settled in France, Henri becoming a naturalized citizen of the Republic. His sister Mina Bergson, also known as Moina Mathers, married the English occult author Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers. Now that's important because we're going to read about him. A leader of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and the couple later relocated to Paris as well. Now, read about him. You can see what was in this family. The Samuel Liddell, 1854-1918, was a famous magician and one of the most influential figures in modern occultism. He is primarily known as one of the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a ceremonial magic order whose offshoots still exist today. He was born January 8th in London, England. His father, William M. Mathers, died while Samuel Liddell was still a boy. His mother, whose maiden name was Collins, died in 1885. He attended the Bedford Grammar School. Mathers was an eccentric whose chosen lifestyle was unusual in its time. He added the MacGregor surname as a claim to Highland Scottish heritage, although there is little evidence of such in his family background. He was a practicing vegetarian, possibly a vegan. Does everyone know the difference? An outspoken and anti-vivisectionist, and a non-smoker, which was very unusual in the 19th century. So you couldn't open up animals in vivisection. It is known that his main interests were magic and the theory of war. His first book was a military manual. Mathers was initiated into an order of Freemasonry on October 4th, 1877. On January 30th, 1878, he became a master mason, and in 1882 he was admitted to the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia. The Rosicrucians are the really deep Masons. That is a sinister order, where he became a member of the High Council within 4 years. So you know he had to be really, really evil. In 1903, the Societas Rosicruciana became the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. His wife was Moina Bergson, also known as Mina Bergson, Mina Mathers, the sister of the philosopher Henri Bergson. Mathers apparently knew how to read and translate a number of languages, including English, French, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Gaelic, and Coptic. His translations of such books as the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, I guess, the Kabbalah Unveiled, the Key of Solomon, the King, and the Lesser Key of Solomon, while probably justly criticized with respect to quality, were responsible for making what had been obscure and inaccessible material widely available to the non-academic English-speaking world. They have had considerable influence on the development of occult and esoteric thought since their publication. In addition to many supporters, he had many enemies and critics. One of his most notable enemies was one-time friend and pupil Aleister Crowley, who is just the king of occult, if you look him up. Aleister Crowley, the occultist of all time. Mathers died on November 5th or November 20th in 1918. The manner of his death was unknown. His death certificate lists no cause of death. He probably committed suicide or was killed by the devil or something. Violet Firth, Diane Fortune, claimed his death was the result of the Spanish influenza of 1918. As few facts are known about Mathers' private life, verification of such claims is very difficult. So he's in the family, this guy. Right. Bergson's life was the quiet and uneventful one of a French professor, the chief landmarks in it being the publication of his 4 principal works, first in 1889, Essai sur les données immédiates de la conscience, which comes over in English, Time and Free Will, which is not really the translation. It means essay on the immediate givens, or facts, you might say, of of consciousness. Conscience in French means both conscience and consciousness. That's distinguished in English. Then Matière et Mémoire, Matter and Memory, in 1896. L'évolution créatrice, Creative Evolution, which is his major work, in 1907. And finally, Les deux sources de la morale et de la religion, the 2 sources of religion, morality and religion, in 1932. He said in his testament that he would have converted to the Catholic faith, but he did not in order not to abandon his fellow Jews in the Nazi persecution. He died in 1941, so he decided to remain a Jew out of solidarity with his fellow Jews. Bergson's principal work is called Evolution créatrice. In this work, he revives the old philosophy of Heraclitus, the one, everything is the many. You see, Parmenides, everything is one. Heraclitus, everything is the many. So those were the 2 great lines of philosophy that started in the Greek world, who said that everything is in a constant state of flux because everything is material and multiplied. There is no single unifying element. For him to exist is to change, and to change constantly and totally. So being is becoming. You see, there's no such thing as being for him. Everything is becoming. being is meaningless, that something is static is meaningless. Everything is becoming. There is no thing. There are only actions. These are quotes. The thing is the result of a solidification operated by our understanding. In other words, it's something like what they call a screenshot. If you freeze a moment of development or becoming, well, then you have a thing. So it's just something that you create in your mind that, something's a thing. Because it's moving all the time. Matter is a flux rather than a thing. Thus he denies being and replaces it with becoming. The logical consequences are clear. Substance disappears. There are only modes of being without beings, only attributes without a subject, actions without an agent, passions without anything which undergoes the passion, movements without a mobile thing. You have to think about that. If you deny being, and where everything, the prime metaphysical principle is becoming, you have to deny all of those things then. There are changes, but there are not things which change. Change has no need of a support. Movement does not imply a movable thing. Oh, he has a big influence. Bergson is a big figure. He says that to look for a thing which changes is merely in order to satisfy our imagination. Bergson sees in the evolutionary process an impulse which advances it to higher levels. This impulse is a vital urge, the élan vital, which had a big influence World War I in the French army. They bought into the élan vital, that if you have this vital urge, you're going to beat back the Germans, and that you can overcome any enemy with the élan vital. So, what time is it? Okay, we have a few minutes. Bergson's disciple, Le Roi, which means the king, denied the absolute necessity and universality of the principle of contradiction. The principle of contradiction is something cannot be and not be at the same time. So a cow cannot both be a cow and not a cow at the same time. That's known as the principle of contradiction. And all knowledge rests on the principle of contradiction. Because if you can look at a cow and say, that's a cow, but it's not a cow, then you're crazy. You see, then, oh, really? It's both a cow and not a cow at the same time, right? Right. And you're nuts. That's insanity. It's absurdity. The very reason why you laugh is because you embrace an absurdity. Think of a very well-dressed woman sitting at a table, and she's very elegant, and then she gets a pie in the face. Why is that funny? Because there's contradiction. See, there's the statement of dignity, and then it is contradicted by the pie in the face. That's humor. It is absurdity. That's why you laugh. So, that's a very sort of basic form of humor, but all humor is based on some absurdity, some contradiction. See, sarcasm is all based on contradiction. You say something, I'm trying to think of Father Chikata, but he's not here. He was great at sarcasm. The understate what?
Well, I had an example. One of his, he said somebody once said sarcasm always has a negative effect, and he responded, "Yeah, right."
Yeah, he was said some really funny, sarcastic things, and but that's also a form of contradiction. So to deny the principle of contradiction means that you're in radical absurdity, and that's what Sartre said. We do live radical absurdity. Everything is absurd. The existentialists will say that. This is absurdity. We live in absurdity. That's why the existentialists had the theater of the absurd. This is really sick stuff. Sick, sick, sick. All right? As if this principle is verified only in immobile things and not in becoming itself, which is the fundamental reality. So if becoming is being, in other words, if you substitute that, then it's true because nothing ever is what it is. To say this is a cow is impossible in that system because it's becoming something else. It's just flowing. All right? I think we'll probably have to cut it off there. Yeah, okay.